Welcome back to the New Indian Express's ThinkEdu Conclave 2021. Our first speaker, Sanjeev Sanyal, is currently serving as the Principal Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance. Sanyal, a Rhodes Scholar and Eisenhower Fellow, he was Deutsche Bank's Global Strategist and a Managing Director till 2015. He is also the author of several books, including The Indian Renaissance, India's Rise After 1,000 Years of Decline, Land of the Seven Rivers, A Brief History of India's Geography. Our second speaker, Arun Maira, is a management consultant and former member of the Planning Commission of India. He is also former India chairman of Boston Consulting Group. The speakers will be in conversation with author and columnist Shankar Iyer.
So I'm going to sort of set it up, say that we all know where we are in terms of where the economy is. We are on the path of incipient recovery or robust recovery, depending on who's telling the story. We are also looking forward to more changes. And I must say that this has been one of my old theories, that India transforms when there is a crisis, and crisis compels change. That was the subject of my first book, Accidental India. So I'm going to sort of start off there. So we had a crisis, there was a pandemic, and we moved on several fronts, on labor laws, on agriculture, productivity linked incentive schemes for manufacturing. We are now talking about privatization. So what do we need to do to sustain the current trajectory and to sustain growth in the future? So if you could take a couple of minutes to set it up, then we'll come to Sanjeev, and then we'll take the discussion forward.
Thank you very much, Shankar. I'm so pleased that you've invited me to be in this discussion with Sanjeev and with yourself. You had given us a nice briefing beforehand, in which you'd explained what you just said, using some other words also, which was, is India too chaotic for perennial change in the economy, or is every crisis an opportunity? And I felt that I come from the private sector. As you said, I've been a consultant to private sector and to government. And nowadays, the whole term for the last few years about the world has been, the world is in a VUCA stage. VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. And business people, business leaders are being taught how to strategize and implement change in a VUCA world. And the same applies to government, of course. So in a situation where, in a stage of the world's history, where things must keep changing and will keep changing, to talk about permanent change seems to me an oxymoron. But we should be saying change is permanent. And what we've got to do is to have the ability to thrive in permanent change. So with this, I want to reframe the question about reforms and to say that what we need to do is to reform the process by which we have been making reforms, to make that process adapted to a VUCA world where change will be constant and it'll be complex because change is arising from many different sides of the system, infecting all other sides of the system at the same time, which is why it becomes so complex. So when I was in the planning commission, I'm going to just mention that, and then we can go further afterwards. Is I was charged by the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh that being a consultant to organizations around the world to live and thrive in a VUCA world, could I bring that knowledge that I had to the Planning Commission of India, which was an institution which was seemingly unable to catalyze adequate change and help the country to implement it, um, to bring about the sort of reforms you're talking about just now in land, labor, manufacturing, and so on. So with that, I did go to a journey of learning myself with the help of the World Bank, with the German Development Organization, GIZ, and many other people to see how countries um, make complex reforms. And they have done it before. It's not the first time that any country is required to make a complex reform, including ourselves. And I learned something, and I might point out then about the two reforms when we talk of crisis. It is said very often that we were able to make the first generation reforms in 1991 because there was a crisis. And so now we are hoping that this COVID crisis will enable us to similarly make another set of reforms. The point is the two reforms are very different. The first, thank goodness we keep calling them the first generation and this one the second generation, because the second generation reforms are very different in their scope and their complexity compared to the first generation reforms. The first generation reforms affected a small set of stakeholders immediately, who resisted that change, and it got gotten over. The second generation of reforms in land, in labor, in industrial policies that affect and trade policies that affect small people, small enterprises, and farmers and agriculture are reforms in which there are many stakeholders involved, small ones who have different situations and big ones around the country. So this is not a stroke of the pen type reform where, there's a crisis and then you say, okay, I give a speech and here's an announcement and you then thereafter have got the reform done. It doesn't happen like that. So we studied that and we came to certain conclusions, but I'd like to withhold giving those conclusions until you ask again. Thank you.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Sanjeev, we, under the Modi Sarkar, we've done some interesting disruptions, demonetization, then GST, the insolvency and bankruptcy code. Now, how they played out, how much of that brought impact is still an ongoing story. I think we'll have to wait for a calmer moment in history to sort of recognize what the benefits of those are. Certainly, the one aspect that has seemed delivered is the Aadhaar-based direct benefit transfer, which has sort of made transfers to people much more efficient, enabled opening, financial inclusion, and then other things. Now, in the last 6 months, we've had, I must say, a slew of reforms, and starting with how we sort of opened up some of the FDIs in some of the sectors. We have looked at the farm laws, expanded the productivity linked scheme, and also now we're talking about privatization. Now, when we look at the parade of these reforms, the one striking thing is that the factors of productivity, land, labor, and capital. So capital is still a matter of central policy, but land, labor are largely states. So would you sort of kindly set it up and say which part of the reforms the center has done and how you're propelling it further by getting the states to participate in it? The process itself, for instance, arguably the way the farm reforms were handled, I'm personally a sort of a proponent of whatever has been done in the farm reforms. This is something that should have been done decades ago. I mean, it took us 70 years to free the largest private sector in India, which is agriculture. But the process itself, whether that can be improved, because now we are coming at a confluence of policy changes which affect as Ms. Myra said, a large landscape of stakeholders. So how are we doing this, and what do you think the government has in its mind to sort of take this forward?
I think the first and most important thing to realize is that we have a very consistent economic framework. So the intellectual framework of these reforms should be left in no doubt. We are about a strong but limited state. This is maybe quite different from both the extremes. On one side, the libertarian idea of a sort of very small state, and the Nehruvian idea of a weak but all pervasive state. We have a very clear view that there are certain things the state should do. So provide security, defense, provide infrastructure, and you will see those are the kinds of things we like investing in. On the other hand, we are quite unapologetic about doing things like privatization, opening up new sectors and so on. So first thing, I hope you appreciate that there is a clear, consistent view on how our economy should function. Secondly, no matter when you do these reforms, there will always be pushback, because the reason they do not get done is because, of course, there are people who have been sort of pushing back against it. Otherwise, they would have already been done, right? So at some point in time, once you have done a lot of discussion, you have to be willing to begin doing those reforms. One of the things you have to be prepared is, even those who have been great proponents of these reforms for decades will then stand up and say that, the exact way in which the reform was done was not quite correct. You will hear many lectures from academics based in the US about how actually the process should have been somewhat different from the one they had written in some paper years ago. But the fact is, almost all the reforms we are doing have been debated for decades. They are in the economic surveys, very often written by those who are now turned critics. And at some point in time, you have to be willing to go out and do them. Crisis or no crisis. And the important thing is, as Mr. Myra just pointed out, it is not merely a matter of making a grand announcement. You have to sit in there and manage its implementation into the future. So, very often, you have to be willing that when you first introduce the policy, it will initially not work, and you have to then correct it along the way. So, for example, the GST, we could have debated it for years, but the only known way of actually getting a country as complex as India to have a GST is to actually introduce it and then fix it. The same thing is true of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. The same thing is true of 200 other reforms that we will do. We are happy for it to not quite work in the beginning and then fix it along the way. We have no ego about this. We will watch if it works. We will make tweaks and make it work. We are not of the opinion that just because we announce something, it will work in one shot. In fact, even the 1991 reforms needed lots of tweaking over the subsequent decade. So the point I'm making clearly is, we are in it for the long haul. We recognize that these reforms 2.0 will take some time. We recognize that there will be pushback, but we have to be willing to carry on. And yes, there will be moments where some of the pushback is legitimate. So even that you have to accommodate. So I think the issue here is to be clear about what we are doing in the medium to long run, introduce the changes, and tweak them where necessary.
So Sanjeev, let me tempt you with a crystal ball and say that now where we are, what do you think the glide path is? Where are we sort of taking this forward in terms of the next steps? How do you get, for instance, I mean, for me, it's mystifying that although the BJP is in power in 15 states, the kind of evangelism or persuasion that should have been there in promoting the idea of the farm reforms, for instance, wasn't visible till the sort of agitation hit the roads. But that said, I mean, now Shivraj Chauhan and other people are sort of taking it further. But how do you get the states on board? For instance, two major programs of the government. One is water, drinking water, and the second is healthcare. Now, both require the states to deliver. In 1983, N.T. Ramarao said the center is a conceptual myth and every inch of India is ruled by the states, which is true and not so true because central policies are still made in Delhi. So how do you get the states to come on board? Because the pushback is off by APMC, didn't get disbanded, or the other things didn't happen. For instance, now the Power Minister has been talking about the need to liberate distribution, give consumer a choice. And that acquired heft only when the Prime Minister started speaking about it. So how do you make those things happen? That's the part I sort of wanted to hear from you. We get it that there is a consistency, that there is a certain approach this government has towards reforms, which is not a minted solution, but a solution which is sort of evolving all the time. But fair enough. I mean, that's how public policy works. But where do you see this heading? I mean, could you, for instance, look at the bad loans bank idea? Could you look at the development financial institution idea that has come up in the budget? I mean, we've had IFCI, UTI, IDBI, ICICI, IDFC, all these. They didn't work. So what gives the government the confidence that this will work this time? So, I mean, so there must be a certain calculation that you guys have worked on. I'm sure in your position as the principal economic advisor, you've been a part of it. And I have a very important question about the role of the state, which I will come to after I hear you and Mr. Maeda.
So I think one of the things you need to understand is that our entire worldview is driven by a particular way of thinking about the future and uncertainty. That showed through repeatedly, even in the way we dealt, for example, with the COVID crisis, which is this, that uncertainty of the world is a given, and the way you deal with the future is through iterative approach. And you saw that even with our COVID handling. Now, given that that is how we think about the world in the first place, so therefore, how do we think about the post-COVID world? Well, the first thing that we are quite sure about is that the post-COVID world is not a reinflation of the pre-COVID world. It will have its own technology, it will have its own supply chains, it will have its own consumer behavior, unintended consequences of where all these things and how they interact. So it is important for us to have a broad idea and then keep at it. So some things will work very well with the states, some things won't. We will try them out. If something is so critical and it hasn't worked, we will go back to the drawing board and try it in a different way again. So now, for example, let me give, since you talked about dealing with the states, well, actually many things have worked rather well with the states. I mean, for all the criticism there was, actually, 99% of the time, the coordination between center and states in the COVID response was rather good. Otherwise, it wouldn't have worked at all. For all the whining and grinding that happens over the GST council, actually the GST largely works, and the states have the majority of the vote in the GST council. So there are many things that work. Many of the things like, for example, the Swachh Bharat toilet building program could not have happened without the states participating in it. So I think people give too much credence to the media noise about this friction and that friction and the political wranglings. A lot of work does get done. It is true some things don't get done, but then the key approach is to, if it is worthwhile doing, then try it again. And by the way, some things do work in certain states and not in others. Then the benefits of that from the state where it worked do ultimately filter through to the others. So I think the point is to have a approach of hammering away, pushing away iteratively, and try and get things done. I am not of the view that you have to have this great grand plan ex ante and then just implement it. That is precisely why we shut down the planning commission. It was not just about the difficulty of doing something. It's a conceptual problem we have with the idea of planning in that way. We don't like master planning. This is about iterative hammering away.
Okay, Mr. Maeda. So we have heard from Sanjeev about the approach to how things happen. And this is different and similar to the approach that we've seen before. The one thing about the government is that when the Prime Minister takes up a project like a Jan Dhan Yojana or the subsidy sacrifice idea for LPG, or when he picks up something like, how to take, how to deal with the social aspects of poverty in the rural area, Ujjwala and stuff, and the rural electricity. These things get done efficiently. There is a certain element of efficiency in it. There is also the fact that, while Sanjeev might say that people pay too much credence to what appears on the media, what appears on the media is really what people are saying. So I must defend the media while we are on a media platform. So, and having been a journalist for 37 years, I think I owe it to my brethren that they speak. They may not reflect complete and total truth, but neither does the government. So, what would you like to see happen next to make India sort of rise to the challenge of the disruptions that, it is true that the world as it emerges from COVID will emerge into a cusp of disruptions, climate, technology, demography. Things are not going to be what they are. The new normal is probably the most cliched phrase that's being used in the current days. So what would you like to see as somebody who's been in consulting, somebody who's been in planning commission, somebody who's an observer of the policy impulse?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, Sanjeev has, put me in the place where I can build on what he's saying and what you have said. It's about, the planning commission was not delivering the goods. Okay, so that was the question that I was asked by Dr. Manmohan Singh to explore. What needs to change in the way we are going about planning and reforming so that we can produce results faster? The speed is important. Yes, reforms and policy making are iterative processes. You do reaction, you quickly learn or don't quickly learn, but just keep holding on to what you believe and don't learn. And so sometimes it takes, in some places, countries, it takes longer. In other countries, they're able to implement equally complex reforms faster. Both are iterative processes and learning processes. So it comes to who is learning faster, who is learning faster. And this was a conclusion that came when we compared the time that various countries have taken over the last 50, 60 years in different complex reforms, that India was probably one of the slowest learners as a state. The slowest learners is a slow learning state. Sanjeev has put the point about the role of the state, and I'm glad we're talking about that, that it's neither this nor that. But the question is, what is the state? The state, and what is the state of our state? The state is a process, it's not a thing. And the state is created by the interactions of people and the decisions that they come to together, which we then say we are able to evolve our state and are always in a good state. Don't feel a crisis. No, this is a bit theoretical, but let's come down to what we found, that when we talk about implementation, yes, India has had and even now has an idea about what are the correct reforms to do for agriculture. They have been devised, we say yes, by some world-class experts within India, as well as we say with consultation with stakeholders. Now, when I was in the Planning Commission and we looked at the histories of consultations and also how they were being done on the same matters we're talking about on land and so on, and we found that the consultation is really a pro forma. You get people and you say, we want to hear you. They sit in a room together, they say a few things or don't say anything. Then there's a record about who you consulted, and you take the decision that the few experts told you you should take. And this has been the pattern of the agriculture reform consultations for the last so many years, okay? But so we can say so many consultations were held. The question was, what was the quality of those consultations? Who was included? Included doesn't mean just on the list. Did they feel heard? This is the point what you're saying. The media points out that actually they say they weren't heard. You say you heard them, they didn't hear you. Unki man ki baat nahi suni aapne. So this is where we came down to, that India and our experts and our government is feeling that we need to do firm, tough reforms guided by our best experts, and then we splutter along. So the implementation problem arises because of the earlier problem of how you went about determining what should be the reforms. And if the matter is complex, like you're pointing out, Shankar, yes, the number of stakeholders are very many and very diverse. They speak in various voices, and you have to have the ability early on to build a process early on to do that very quickly and effectively. If you don't do that quickly and effectively, then when you announce the reform, there will be a reaction. And of course, as I said, there always will be, you can't get anything perfect the first time, but we must reduce the number of iterations and the time it takes. This was the essence of the total quality movement in Japan, to use that metaphor. That, the Japanese were able to improve the levels of the industries from one level to the next much faster than the Europeans and Americans, who were also improving at the same time. And so the Japanese caught up, and thereafter they remained ahead because they were learning faster and they were learning to do very complex things, industrial reforms and so on. So I could share with you what we then did in the Planning Commission to look at the subject about jobs, industry, and manufacturing growth. And the process that we used was really declared to be the best reform process used in this matter in the world. But no one in India noticed the process and what came out of it. We still had the same solutions of the China type solution of having big zones and so on put down. And I had the pleasure of two things after the Planning Commission was disbanded. One, to be invited to speak at international conferences of government leaders and development experts on how to do reforms in industry and manufacturing. So I'm teaching them something that we had learned but weren't applying. And the Niti Aayog is another thing that's given me great joy, because the Prime Minister disbanded the Planning Commission for reasons that Sanjeev has given us. And then he created a charter. If you read that charter, what does it say? The charter says National Institution for Transforming India by enabling the states to learn, by enabling India to operate like a flotilla of independent ships all sailing in the same direction. It was learning the processes of how reforms are made in states, at the center, in districts, and teaching people to work with others to make the reforms in their state. I'm using the word state more generically now. Now, this is where the Niti Aayog lately, I find, is going. But otherwise, we are again saying economics, what's the economic reform? And we want experts in economics. And the experts in economics in the present Niti Aayog are probably just as good or just as bad as the experts were in the Planning Commission.
Well, the landscape, the landscape is the same. But
yes.
I often remember something that I learned from Dr. Reddy when he was in the finance ministry, and Montek and others used to say. So the general belief was that there is a strong consensus for weak reforms because of the capacity of the state, and that the state is doing things that may not necessarily do, and is not doing things that it needs to do. But I'm just going to shift because we have a constraint of time. So I wanted to get Sanjeev into something that I hear is happening in the government, is to relook at whether we need all those departments, whether we need all those ministries. Maybe about 10 years back, I had done a cover story listing the number of ministries which really had no business existing. Things have changed. Maybe, we decontrolled steel in 1993. We still have a steel ministry. For the life of me, I can't understand why the rural development ministry the center should have. But these are all legacies that we are carrying, the 42nd Amendment problems that we are sort of carrying forward. Sanjeev, would you be sort of open to discussing on what's happening in terms of the reorganization of departments and ministries in the government?
So you're absolutely right. Since 1947, we have kept adding more and more departments and autonomous bodies and ministries and so on. Some happened because of political reasons, but some of them may have been perfectly reasonable things to do back in the 50s or 60s, but we didn't then shut them down afterwards. So this continuous accumulation of various kinds of organizations, which having once been established are extremely difficult to shut down. Just to put it in context, the central government alone has some 800 autonomous bodies of various kinds. Some cultural bodies, some will relate to, obscure activities. Some of you, will be surprised to know, but they may have like 5 acres of land in the middle of Delhi. and a senior official who presides over whatever that activity is. So this kind of thing is all pervasive. It's there all over the country in state governments as well. What we are doing right now is finally re-looking at many of these institutions, departments, autonomous bodies, and again beginning to cull them down. Now, again, there are two ways of going about it. One would have been the master plan approach, is to do a grand scan of every ministry and then sort of get what it should be ideally and try and implement that. But as I pointed out to you, our entire process is iterative. So what we are doing is exactly the opposite. We are going instead ministry by ministry and then autonomous body by autonomous body. So we are actually doing it sort of bottom up. And already dozens of such organizations have been rationalized, shut down, merged, and so on, as we speak. And I'll just tell you a few of them. For example, in the film industry, there used to be a whole bunch of these institutions: Children's Film Society, Films Division of India, and a whole bunch of them. They have now been basically merged into one. And hopefully now it'll have a minimum amount of cluster of activities. And at the same time, there were many things which we should not have been doing in the government, which will not get done. And then, this minimum cluster will be able to upgrade its technology and so on. We did the same thing. We had something called, we have dozens of organizations to look at, say, for example, promotion of jute at the central level. I mean, I understand West Bengal having a lot of things at the ground, but central government had significant numbers, jute commissioner, Indian Jute Export Promotion Council, all kinds of jute related things. They have now got reduced in number. Similarly, there were a whole bunch of organizations for handicraft and handloom. So some of them have been rationalized, shut down, merged, like the All India Handicraft Board, All India Handloom Board. And many of these organizations were duplicating activities of others. Some of these boards had not met in 20 years, and yet their paraphernalia existed. So this is what is being done as we speak.
So one of the things that also sort of strikes me is that the locational issues of a department in a particular ministry, or the existence, I'm not talking about the existence of certain ministries, so that's a longer thing. For instance, I know that the Bureau of Industrial Standards, for instance, is in the Ministry of Consumer Affairs. I mean, beats logic, but there must be some logic to that. I mean, I would rather think that the Bureau of Industrial Standards should be in the Ministry of Industrial Development or the DIP, where you set standards on what you want to do. Similarly, the issue of skilling, for instance, which is going to be very critical, is sort of spread across two ministries, neither of which are owning it. Now, if you look at water, for instance, it's managed by 7 ministries. Health has some 70 laws. So these are things that actually define the efficiency or inefficiency of the state. I'm sort of hoping that the government's exercise in reviewing these issues will cover both locational and also existential questions.
No. So absolutely true. So, for example, there is one unit that is being looked at for, restructuring, which is the Salt Commission. The Salt Commission owns 60,000 acres of land along the India's coastline, including several thousand acres on Mumbai Island, which are hugely valuable. And there is a salt service which runs this. But ironically, almost none of the salt that you and I eat comes from the lands of the salt service. Basically, most salt is produced industrially. Yeah. But this institution, this is a 200-year-old institution, and it continues to exist because it continues to exist. And in fact, it's basically not nothing to do with salt. It simply manages legacy lands. So
salt of power.
Yes. So there are similar, lots and lots of organizations. By the way, I'll give you one example of another one. There's something called a tariff commission. Now, whenever I mention the institution called tariff commission, most people assume that it has something to do with commerce and setting tariffs on imports and so on. Far from it, the tariff commission actually sits in DPIIT, the industry ministry. And what does it do? Well, it is a legacy from the pre-liberalization days, i.e. pre-1991 days, when internal tariffs of things like special steels, copper, etc., used to be set by the government. So the unit that was supposed to do it still exists. It has a full office with a secretary level head and scores of officials and so on. And so 30 years after, uh, you know, liberalization, the unit that used to actually run this, price setting of the socialist era still exists with a full complement of officials. So these are the kinds of institutions that need to be rationalized, redeployed. Many things need to be done. So, and that is being done.
I think I'm getting a message saying that I have to sort of try and bring a semicolon on this discussion, because no discussion on economic reforms can have a full stop. So I'm going to try and sort of wrap this up with a question for both you, Mr. Myra, and for you, Sanjeev. In the immediate future, in the immediate term of, when we are coming out of the lockdowns and COVID and everything, we're going to be facing several issues. So please suggest what you think are the two things that you would like the government to take up to push, so that not only we come out of this and the recovery is sustained, but we also sort of are able to shift orbit, in terms of how we deal with the future challenges. And some of the challenges we know, some we don't know all the challenges and how they will play out. But the two things that would sort of equip India to sort of look at the future, what would be those two things? First, you, Mr. Patel.
You pointed out that we got to do many things, and the COVID has brought about the urgency to do many things at the same time. It's not just a public health problem that we got to address, it's an education problem. It is also, as you mentioned, the water and our physical environment problem, and well as the banking sector and so many problems all at the same time, Okay, so what this is going to require is a different approach on two dimensions in how we make reforms and policies and implement them. One is we need much better systems thinking amongst anybody and everybody who is at the helm of reforms and policy making, and even going deeper levels down. Systems thinking. This is not the way that we as experts usually think. We'll think about a narrow domain in which we have the precise solutions. Systems thinking. The second is collaborative policy making. So this point about, breaking departments, you'll have to break big governments into departments anyway, but nothing like the skills one that you mentioned can be given to just one ministry, because the skills will be created by activities in many ministries. You may not have a steel ministry separately, but you'll have something to look after industry. Maybe they are responsible for skills, so why have a separate skills ministry? And so on. So this whole thing that we can by structure solve this problem is way of thinking we have to change. We must improve structures like Sanjeev has said. Some things become dead, they must be weeded out because they're taking cost and delaying decision making because they get involved and should not be. But we are going to have divisions into structures in any complex organization. To work collaboratively amongst them, it's an orientation and a skill as well as systems thinking. And this is what we found, that the training of our people to think as systems thinkers and to then work collaboratively is what Niti Aayog has been charged to do in the charter. This is the single point agenda with which we'll make many reforms much more effectively and more quickly than we have been able to so far.
Sanjeev, one of the things that I sort of keep thinking about is 30 years after dismantling of license Raj, which is basically what the reforms in 91 were, we also sort of have not moved, because in terms of, like, for instance, for a power project, it takes over 90 clearances, for a hotel about 110 clearances. And although we are much more efficient in our clearances, has there been any rethink on whether those clearances are required at all? Whether those files should move yo-yo up and down between, say, Kanpur and Delhi, and Kanpur and Lucknow, and Kanpur and Delhi, I mean, that's one thing that sort of I'm hoping that your exercise sort of looks into that. But your two things that you think that will make a difference for India.
Well, since you're talking about immediate issues, well, obviously one immediate issue that we will pay attention to is to make sure that the infrastructure build out push that we promised in the budget is carried out and followed through, because critically that is a major part of our attempt to rebuild economic momentum. So that is one thing that we are paying very close attention. And the second thing, which fits with what you just mentioned, is just like we are looking at the structures of government, we are also looking at structures of policies and regulations. And the way we go about it, as you may have noticed, is unlike in the past, by the way, the economic survey you will see is a very good guide to how things are being thought about. So one of the chapters you may want to read is the chapter 6 in volume 1, which makes the intellectual case for simplifying regulations. So if you read that, we make a very strong case for simplification of regulations, which is a very different case than the one, say, the libertarians would do for deregulation. We have a different reason why we want to simplify regulations. And that is something that we are already doing in a big way. If you look at the last few months, we have done massive deregulations in several sectors. For example, the geospatial and cartography sector, just 10 days ago, we completely opened it up. Similarly, there were these outdated regulations, telecom regulations on the BPO and IT sector. And I can't believe that we had those regulations on OSPs. And those have been completely removed. And we recognize that even after removing them, there'll be another 3 things that we hadn't thought need removing will pop up, and we'll discover them. We will then work on those and remove those as well. So, minimum government, maximum governance, unfortunately, people, given their proclivities, look at one or the other, but actually they only make sense when they go together. And so we are doing a lot of deregulation as we speak.
Fair enough. One of these days, we should have a session again and invite Mr. Myra and you and sort of look at the cause and effect of the reforms that are being done and how they work through. And probably we'll have to wait for another occasion for this. But thank you, both of you. This has been a very lively discussion. And it's a good thing that we focused on the thinking, the approach, the strategy, rather than just tactical issues, which anyway are being sort of spoken and discussed about. I hope this discussion sort of goes further. And thank you for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shankar. Thank you, Sanjeev, too.
We hope you enjoyed that session. If you want to catch the other sessions of the ThinkEdu Conclave 2021, you can log on to eventexpress.com, newindianexpress.com, or even edxlive.com. If you are more of a social media person, you can also join us on our Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube handles. Thank you for watching. A raging pandemic, a dearth of life-saving equipment, and 90 days to manufacture a world-class ventilator. That is what the book, The Ventilator Project, is all about. We have the book's author, Amitabh Bandyopadhyay, who is also an associate professor at IIT Kanpur. He has conducted his doctoral research in the laboratory of Professor Uma Das Moitro at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York. Upon receiving his PhD in 2002, he joined the laboratory of Professor Clifford Tabin at Harvard Medical School for his postdoctoral research. We also have Shrikant Shastri, who has co-authored the book The Ventilator Project. Shastri works with CEOs and owners of fast-growing organizations to help them navigate through the challenges and opportunities in an uncertain world. As a mentor and advisor, he guides them in incubating new ideas, initiatives, and ventures that bring in growth. Chief reporter Daniel Thimaya will be chairing the session.
So let me dive straight in. You know, going back about a year in time, roughly, March 16th, when the Prime Minister, of course, just before the entire country went on lockdown, the Prime Minister came out and there was a call for innovation, to fight COVID and to come up with innovations because essentially borders were closed. Life as we know it was not ever going to be the same again. How did that inspire you, Professor Bandyopadhyay, to send out that message and call for, innovations? Of course, incubators in China, of course, there was a big need for incubators because they were talking about it as one of the frontline defense mechanisms to cope with people with COVID who were intensive. How did this call go out? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure that every Indian in those days, they were all thinking, how can we help the country? Okay, so me, IIT Kanpur, our incubated companies were no different. So when a message from none other than the Prime Minister came, we all thought that what is the best way to go about it. And I sent out the message as an SOS to the entire incubated company group. We have a WhatsApp group. Sent it out to them, and many people responded. Some made the low-hanging fruits like PPE kits, the mask. The mask is being worn by the Prime Minister himself and our Defense Minister, and many. It's called Swasa N95 mask. And then came these two young boys there, 2018 graduates, and they have been making these solar panel cleaning robots. They said that we would like to make ventilator. And, in those days, in the hindsight, ventilator was not really a key player for COVID treatment. But in those days, everybody thought that ventilator is a must-have. If you just look at the newspaper headlines in those days. So, we jumped right ahead.
So, Shrikant, you're somebody who evaluates projects very fast. Given the number of startup pitches that you probably hear, you're probably more inundated than half the guys in Silicon Valley at the moment. But when you first heard of what Noka was doing, and I'm sure Professor Amitabh brought you this proposal for these guys, very young, very, very driven, saying that we can bring up, put together a ventilator with pretty much very little expertise. What was the first thought that hit you?
Well, I think all of us were wanting to get involved and make a contribution at that point of time. So when Amitabh called me, he said, look, these guys, I knew these two guys from before because I'd spent time at the incubator. So I knew they were smart guys, no questions on that count. But he said, will you talk to them? I said, of course. So I told them, look, I believe you built something cool. Can you tell me more? So they sent me a WhatsApp image of a short video they'd created of their initial version. Very, very rough version. There was something working there using artificial lung, a balloon kind of a thing. The lung was being inflated. I said, tell me more. Then they sent me a detailed engineering drawing. Now, I've been out of engineering now for 35 years, so I had to kind of really grit myself to look at the drawing and understand it, but I did. And then Amitabh and I chatted, and we brought in Saurabh Srivastava, who's also a well-known person in startup ecosystem. He's also on the board with us. So we said, look, there is something to this. These guys have thought it through. Let's support them. So basically, it was a quick decision within a matter of 48 hours, literally. It helped that we knew these two guys and knew they were innately talented. But we said, now let's help because they are a best candidate at this point of time.
Professor Bandyopadhyay, it's interesting because once this task force was put together, you had all of these, you had this very varied mix of very, very seasoned, experienced people who had a wealth of experience in various fields. And you had these very young guys who were extremely, tuned in. They were very they would jam with pretty much anything you give them. It's a very varied mix. And in fact, you talk about it in one of the chapters much later on about the kind of friction that is caused by old and young. But the question that I wanted to ask you was, one very interesting aspect is this 90-day target that you guys got together, to turn around something in 90 days, which is a drop in the ocean when it comes to most research projects or even academics. Why 90 days and how did it come about?
So the objective was clear that we were studying as you will see in the book also, we were studying the relative graphs of COVID cases around the world. When we started, we had less than 100 cases, but we knew that we are going to hit a very, very high number. And again, we have to remember in those days, we did not know that ventilator will not be the ultimate solution. And we were under the impression that it will be. And we did not know either. And thankfully for the country that after September, the number will start to go down. If we compared with the graphs of Europe or US, we were expecting a peak around July, August. And that will be a number, massively high. Therefore, if we had to serve a purpose, then we had no option but to finish it in, as fast as possible. Our original target was to accomplish it within 70 days, but 90 days was a little stretch because some of the regulatory aspects, so we were not very clear. That caused little delay. Yeah.
So Shrikant, when the initial story started hitting the media, and people started labeling it the 50K ventilator, that must have given you, a huge heart attack on one side and a little bit of joy on the other side because people were noticing it. Of course, eventually you did realize that the cost of the components and everything pegged the cost at it almost 6-7 times higher. What were your thoughts when people started calling it the 50K ventilator? Initially?
So initially, actually, all of us were excited about bringing forth a ventilator, which is sub 1 lakh rupees, and 50,000 was not too far from it. We actually stayed with that target for a little bit. What changed was the government regulatory framework kept shifting like goalposts. And every time they made a change, it added cost, added cost, added cost.
The
That's why it
ETS
started
kept changing at least a couple of times. Yeah.
Correct. And that's what made the change. Otherwise, we believed, because as Amitabh said, we expected a massive rise in the number of cases. So our goal was to make a ventilator available to even the smallest hospital in a tier 4 town in India, and therefore make it affordable, because we knew that imported ventilators are 8 lakhs to 20 lakhs and not available in sufficient numbers. And therefore we said, look, we have to make it accessible. So we stayed with that 50K number for a while. We were actually happy with the media coverage that talked about 50K. But the other thing that happened, other than the regulatory goalpost shifting, every Tom, Dick and Harry picked up a basic design and said, I've got a ventilator, I've got a ventilator. And then that's when the government said, look, we must lay down some framework because we can't have quote unquote quacks out in the market with ventilators. And therefore the government put forth a regulatory framework. I just wish there was a lot more clarity on that front at one point of time, actually.
So I have to ask both of you, I mean, was it frustrating when you came up with a 110, and then just when the 110 was done, a few days before it had happened, the goalpost had gone further, and then you worked on the 210. And then even that sort of got pushed back because, the requirements kept getting better. What kind of impact did it have on the youngsters? I mean, were they frustrated? Remember, this is a time when they were stuck at home for about the better part of, say, 4 months, and it's not always easy to not have contacts for that long. Yeah. What kind of impact did it have on these guys?
Okay, so it is very interesting, The youngsters are the ones, see, it was their life and career that was on the line. But it was them who kept us afloat. Like they took all of these challenges in their stride. It was us, the oldies, who were getting more frustrated, angry. Okay, why can't the government say the first thing in the right thing in the first place? But they said, no problem, sir. 3 days. So they had a target of giving us product update every 3 days, and they never failed on doing that. So there was one particular change where it is our fault that we did not understand the government's demand properly, that there has to be a real time of oxygen and air, and that will have to be independent of the rest of the function of the ventilator. So we did not have that, and our first trial, as we have mentioned in the book, did not go in our favor. There were many other issues, but this was the main thing. You would not believe, they flew back from Delhi to Pune, landed, got a taxi, went to Mumbai to our only manufacturing partner. He said that I have something like a mixer, brought it, came to their factory. Next day morning, they said, so now we have a solution. So, it was fantastic. The frustration was only on the oldies part. The youngsters were fantastic.
So just so that the oldies are not made to look bad, let me present one more perspective as well. So I think the youngsters took each of these as a technical challenge. Yes. And now a technical challenge is to a certain extent within their power to solve it. It requires brain power. It obviously requires parts and components, but it's still reasonably within their control. Whereas I think if you look at the division of work we had within the task force, we told the young Noka inventors, you focus on the invention and the design, leave everything else to us. So the oldies had to therefore go out and figure out, how do I now fly in components from Taiwan or Singapore? How do you now figure out what the government is thinking? How much more money do we now need to raise because something has changed? So I guess because the two groups were, it's not two groups, different people were handling different things, and the youngsters were in some ways insulated from a lot of these things. And so therefore that is one part of the story. The other part is that when we were meeting 12 noon every day, the first 10 minutes were spent in celebrating good news, or if there was a bottleneck like this, to perk each other up. And therefore those were literally catharsis sessions for everyone. And therefore you then get back to work when everyone says, wow, okay, now we know we have a problem to solve, let's solve it within 24 hours. So I think combination of these factors, the division of work and the fact that everyone was talking to each other and trying to help everyone else.
Once the Noka actually sort of found its stride, and after that one demo in Delhi, of course, that didn't go so well because of the lack of the cylinder. It goes without saying that the path towards actual production and then getting it out on the market and getting it out to hospitals, many would actually consider that the most difficult part in any startup's ecosystem, right? In any startup's life cycle, I'm sorry. Simply because most of these things are taken for granted with a large pharma major, but with every startup, it is as bootstrapped as it gets, because you don't have the funds, you don't have the people, and you don't even have to think about how bad it can get in a pandemic, right? When you don't have guys who can come to office and you can push them out. And yet, simply because of the kind of people that you roped in and the kind of contacts they had and the kind of reach they had, you guys managed to pull it off, and you managed to pull it off stunningly, right? What were the most amazing, sort of stories from this fairy tale for both of you? Shrikant, maybe you can tell me something that truly restored your hope that, there's a hope for a great future for this country, for this company, for everything.
Yeah. So I'll talk about two stories. One is the role of the much maligned government, and that is one source of hope. The other is the story of collaboration cutting across hierarchies. Both of them are heartwarming. Let's talk about the government first, because government deserves that credit. April 9th, we needed vital components to build the first product. This was still 110. And the components were stuck in Singapore. Singapore was already in lockdown. It was in the distributor's warehouse. No flights, no courier service, no freight service. Knocking at every door, not possible. Without that, we were dead. Finally, we knocked at the doors of the government via Cabinet Secretariat, Ministry of External Affairs, Invest India. Invest India stepped in, reached out to the Indian High Commission in Singapore and said, look, we need to bring this back. And can you do something? And they figured out that there was this empty Singapore Airlines flight coming into India to ferry back stranded Singaporeans in India. And therefore, they said, we'll put the consignment in this. Not only did they work out that full logistics, but banks were not operating at full capacity in India. We couldn't even remit money to the shipper. They said, don't worry, we will stand guarantee. Can you imagine Indian High Commission standing guarantee for that payment? Consignment came on SQ 406 on 9th of April, landed at Delhi, landed at Bombay, it went to Pune. Government stepping up to do things like this on a crisis mode was fantastic, restores hope that there are many good people in the government. Hopefully it will get institutionalized so that everyone can feel the positive impact. The other one is collaboration between old and young. The youngest in the task force is 23, the oldest is 74. The two oldest people at 69 and 74 are Padma Bhushan and Padma Shri respectively. The 23-year-old is a just recent pass out of IIT Kanpur. And the debates in the Zoom call are those of equals. No hierarchies. People are not pulling rank. When the 23-year-old speaks, everyone knows that he's an expert on his topic. Technically, people listen to him. Even if the 69-year-old feels strongly about something and pushes him hard, the 23-year-old pushes back. To me, the breaking down of these hierarchies is so fantastic because it's a relationship of equals, and that kind of collaboration cutting across age groups, areas of expertise. If we build organizations and institutions based on such principles with no hierarchy, and even the older person learning from the younger person, I think that's a great way to move forward. Those to me are the two. There are many, many more anecdotes, but these are very heartwarming ones, memorable ones actually.
Professor, what about you? What was
So I'll tell you.
Story that really touched you?
I cut short in my description of the first 4 days. That was before the task force was formed.
Yeah.
So you understand that these are good engineers. I had no clue that they can actually make ventilators, right? So what I did is I gathered a team of doctors and IIT Kanpur professors to do the brainstorming. That is it at all possible? So the doctors explained what has to be done, and they told them in no uncertain term that, look, either you make an ICU ventilator or don't bother at all. Please do not make an ambu bag. And you know, so many agencies were trying to make ambu bag ventilators. They will little scared because they thought that ICU ventilator will be an invasive process, will they be able to do it, etc. But they got the engineering ideas. And imagine that the stores, everything was closed in those days, right? So they had access to a hobby store in Pune. And look at their logic. They said that, look, we have to do pressure sensing. Now, UAV, the commercially available UAVs, they will have a pressure sensor to measure altitude. So maybe I can use that pressure sensor. We need a pump. Aquariums have air pump. So maybe we can use an air pump from there. So that's how they gathered components. And in 4 days' time, they could give a demonstration of a prototype that Srikant also talked about to Professor Govindarajan. And Govindarajan said, Amitabh, you have a fantastic team. Just go ahead with them. They are capable. So that was like, as a teacher of IIT Kanpur, as a keeper of this technology-based incubator system, it immediately restored faith that we have such fantastic engineers. Nikhil and Harshit are only two examples. I'm sure you have some 1,000 such Nikhils and Harshits. If they are given the right grooming, you will have hundreds of Nokhats being born in a year. So that is number one. And number two is that, as we are doing right now, we are conversing over Zoom, and it is pretty close to having a personal meeting. So suddenly you realize that you do not any longer need to be in the metro cities to achieve something. You can get your mentorship, you can get your connections, you can get everything sitting in a tier 2, tier 3 cities, perhaps even villages. Thanks to the efforts of the successive governments, we have very good internet penetration. Therefore, this is a time when you can create an ecosystem, not only in Bangalore, Pune, Noida, but pan-India. So that is another, very hopeful prospect.
Fantastic. I mean, to think about life without internet, pandemic or otherwise, I think would be very, very difficult for most of us if you really think about it. Srikant, I must ask you, towards the end of the book, one of the things that were sort of very succinctly ruled as a missed opportunity was why, a company like Nokia, which had brought out this fabulous product, and a few others who brought out cutting-edge innovations in line with what the PM had asked for and what the country needed, was that all of the procurement was centrally done, and these contracts very often tend to only go to a certain company, which a certain set of companies which have a certain set of requirements that they fulfill. And how, if we were to perhaps bridge these red tape-laden bureaucratic guidelines, smaller companies would really truly move towards an Atmanirbhar Bharat and really revitalize the whole Make in India, Startup India ecosystem. What are your thoughts on some of the things that could potentially change, especially after this pandemic?
Sure. So, one, it's very clear that for any sector to grow in India, one of two gods has to smile. God number one is government as a big benefactor and buyer. God number two is a big private sector player. To me, Maruti Udyog is a great example. With 50% market share, it has become the god for every auto component manufacturer in India, which is why auto component industry in India is booming. So medical devices, we don't have the second kind of god. So therefore, it comes back to the first kind of god, particularly because the government is the biggest buyer, given that government health infrastructure across the country runs so many hospitals. So unless the government starts buying, you'll never have an Indian medical device industry really growing. Fortunately, I think there are two or three things that are happening now slowly. One is that the government e-procurement system, which even though that came up in 2016, I think, was not really helping startups. So now they've got something
finally gaining some momentum.
Finally gaining some momentum. They have something called as a startup runway as a sub scheme there. So that it doesn't have requirements like you must have a 3-year track record or show me which hospital you deployed in. So they kind of waived off some of those. But having said that, I must still say that most startups have still not felt the impact of that because the startup runway has taken time to take off. Not every bureaucrat understands it. So this is one part. Government as a buyer, willing to take risks and not playing safe by saying, let's buy a multinational product because it's been around for ages. The second would be to create an ecosystem where testing, certification of products and a regulatory framework is totally cleaned up so that you're not kind of shooting in the dark. And that is an area where work is still to happen and we haven't seen much happening. And finally, there is a whole manufacturing ecosystem, which as it happens in the 2020 budget, not just this one, they laid out specific aims and they set out budget allocations for creating what are called as technology clusters where hardware can be manufactured, done prototyped and manufactured. So bits and pieces, the work is happening. But I think with this year, with the pandemic, healthcare, as we saw this year's budget, has got a higher budget. I think at least medical devices, healthcare related products, things will move faster. Can it move faster than this? Yes, absolutely. But I think the intentions are there.
Great. I'm going to wrap this up with just a question or two about the book. The ventilator project, just like the actual ventilator project, has sort of, the book itself has happened at jet speed. And, no part of it is fiction. And yet it's such a sort of thrilling journey that, it makes you feel very good at the end of it. That, guys who probably lived next door to you and you never knew really what they did when they went to work, managed to achieve something that most multinational companies were grappling with. And that to me is a fabulous takeaway from the book. But do tell me, how did you guys manage to get this book out as fast as you did? I know that you did the ventilator in 90 days. How long did it take to do the book?
So the book took, I would say, the actual writing took under 90 days because towards the later part of the task force, two things happened actually. One is that a couple of stray comments. One is one of the senior people in US, Yashdeep Kumar, he said, this model, multinationals need to learn from it. A medical device normally takes 18 to 24 months. The fact that you guys have done it in 90 days without cutting corners is going to be the new paradigm. That is one statement he made. And the second statement was, 90 days, our spouses barely saw us. And therefore, we would go up for meals periodically. And obviously, we would tell them what's been happening. So one day, my wife made a passing remark saying, look, there's so much learning here. Why don't you guys work on a book? So I bounced that idea of Amitabh. He said, yes, let's do it. And fortunately, we get along very well. We're great friends and we have complementary skills. So we said, let's go ahead and do it. After that, I think we wrote a concept note, ran it past a publisher. To the publisher's credit, they liked it quickly. After that, the writing was essentially, Uh, Fortunately, I think both of us believe in structured thinking. So the organizing of the thought process in terms of who are the people we need to talk to, how to document facts. A lot of the facts are available in our WhatsApp groups of the Ventilator Project and the email trails of the Ventilator Project. And we had to plug the gaps by going back and talking to all the 20 members of the task force and people outside. We had to go back and talk to people in the government and others to say, look, let's check these facts one by one and also fill in some of the anecdotes that they saw it from the outside. So I think it was express speed. Amitabh may want to add it as well.
Well, I would say that this was perhaps a tad bit more difficult for me than being in the Ventilator Project, because by that time the classes started. Okay. And, I have serious teaching load. Students started to come back to the lab, so I have to pay attention to them as well. But Srikanth is very, very structured. Okay, so I would basically just plug in and plug out only for the time that I will be actually typing. And Srikanth would have the entire material ready, that what I need to write and why. So it was not very difficult for me. So I basically spent exactly the number of hours that I typed. And then, we arranged for a friend to do the first read of the book and do some edits. So all of these, fantastic planning by Srikanth actually cut down the time.
And there was also one other source of inspiration, the Himalayas. So I spent 2 months in Uttarakhand looking at the mountains and writing. Every morning from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. was my book writing period. So that's how I carved out my time, and rest of the day was business as usual, normal work actually.
I can think of a few better ways to actually sit down and put a book together, honestly. And what I particularly like is each of the chapters ends with a little bit of reflection, and there's a solid, point by point takeaway for everybody who wants to have a startup, who wants to start up, who wants to make their startup go bigger. And I think it's a fantastic idea. I think everybody who's got startup dreams must read the Ventilator Project. Srikanth, of course, had recently tweeted saying the biggest takeaway from the book for him is hope. And honestly, today, as we as we're in the throes of this battle with the pandemic and COVID vaccines going all over the place, hope is all we have. And we have a dream that an Indian product can truly revolutionize the way that we look at life and the way we live life. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been a pleasurable conversation.
Thank you.
I truly look forward to more from you guys, and I hope that Indian products really get the respect that they deserve, both in the market and in our homes and lives. Thank you very much, Srikanth.
Thanks, Danny.
So much.
Thank you, Danny. Pleasure talking to you. Look forward to seeing you in Chennai sometime.
Yes.
Absolutely. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed that session. If you want to catch the other sessions of the ThinkEdu Conclave 2021, you can log on to eventexpress.com, newindianexpress.com, or even edxlive.com. If you are more of a social media person, you can also join us on our Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube handles. A single language policy for India has been a controversial issue for ages. Not all states agree. But then, India is known for its diverse culture and the plethora of languages its people speak. So, is there really a need for a universal language policy? Let's hear it from the Union Education Secretary, Amit Khare. Khare, an Indian Administrative Services officer from the 1985 batch of Jharkhand cadre, became the Higher Education Secretary in 2019. Khare also holds additional charge of Secretary, Department of School Education and Literacy, Editorial Director of the New Indian Express, Prabhu Chawla, and the Vice Chancellor of Shastra deemed to be University, Dr. S. Vaidya Subramaniam, will also be joining the conversation.
Mr. Khare, the topic of our discussion today is one country, one language. Does a united India need a language policy? But I'd like you to start off by telling us in your opening statements exactly where are we with the new education policy, which has almost universally been lauded, been acknowledged as a very good one. But of course, everyone has said that the proof lies in the pudding in the implementation, including you. So, can we hear how far the government has come on the path to implementation, sir?
So thank you very much. And let me start by thanking you and the entire team of the New Indian Express and also the Vice Chancellor of Shastra University for joining us. And I would start by saying that it is not one nation, one language. In fact, in a diverse country like ours, we are a multilingual society. What the national education policy emphasizes is teaching in the regional languages, teaching in mother tongue and in regional languages. So it is not one language or one size fit all. In fact, the beauty of this policy is the flexibility in implementation, the flexibility it offers, not only in terms of language, but in terms of courses. For example, there can be 3-year degree program, there will be 4-year degree program. So depending on what choices a student makes, if somebody wishes to go for research, it is a 4-year degree program. If it is just graduation and then going out in the job market, 3 years would be sufficient. Similarly, multiple entry and exit.
Right.
That is also a flexibility. I mean, there are various components of this policy which will come into effect at different points of time, but we have identified about 10 items which the students will see in the next academic session itself.
Right.
The first is the Academic Bank of Credit, the ABC, because it is actually ABC of the entire higher education system. If we wish to have multiple entry exit, if we wish to have multidisciplinarity, then the Academic Bank of Credit is a must. Otherwise, it will be difficult to manage the records of the students. So the work on the Academic Bank of Credit is on, and by before the start of the next academic session, the Academic Bank of Credit will be there. The second, about multiple entry and exit, that option we have discussed with UGC, and what we have in our mind is that those institutions who join the Academic Bank of Credit and who have accreditation of at least A grade, they will be allowed to have multiple entry and exit within the institution. Across the institution, there will have to be, it will take a little more time because different institutions have different type of courses. So even in the technical side, say, migrating from one IIT to another, as of now, it will be difficult. But within the same IIT or the same university who has an Academic Bank of Credit, somebody can exit after a year and then come back within a specified period and again start the course. So this multiple entry and exit in select institutions. I mean, as you are well aware, there are 1,043 universities, and all of them are in different sizes, different. Many of them are affiliating universities having hundreds of colleges, and the number of students in some of the universities more than 4 lakhs or even higher. Some are research universities. Therefore, we cannot have one size fit all. So the start will be from those universities who join the Academic Bank of Credit and have an accreditation. The third will be about the teaching in the mother tongue. Now, some people, they are making as if it is teaching in Hindi or in Tamil or Telugu. The idea is not teaching in mother tongue by itself, but facilitating talented students who are from non-English background, non-English could be any language, so that their talent is not wasted. And that what we have proposed. There is a task force under me. We'll shortly produce that report. A lot of discussions have taken place. And that will be the online courses of the first year will be available in the regional languages. So while the class may be conducted in English, in addition, the online courses will be available in different Indian languages so that a student can easily understand, even if he or she is from a non-English background, they are not made to suffer because of this, or they should not face a handicap because they are from a non-English background. So that is the third thing. The fourth is about the joint degrees with the different foreign universities. That regulations are also under process by the University Grants Commission. What the commission is likely, I can only say because I am only a member there. There are other members and the chairman. But the discussion that we have had is that the joint degree type of programs, or say a semester in Indian university, a semester in foreign university, and vice versa. So it will not be one-sided that we start sending our students abroad or we only start inviting foreign universities here, but will have to be both ways. The National Research Foundation will also come into place before the next academic session. That proposal has been cleared by the Empowered Committee. The Empowered Finance Committee of Secretaries has cleared it. Hopefully, we are quite hopeful because everybody has supported that by the next academic session, the National Research Foundation will be in place so that faculty can take advantage of the NRL. Online teaching has emerged as a very important tool, and therefore the formation of the National Technological Education Technology Forum, and also you may have read that the percentage of online courses, SWAM courses in any conventional program has already been increased from 20% to 40%. So this part is also complete. So some of these changes will be visible. These changes will be visible from the very start of the academic session. The common entrance exam for the central universities. That by and large, all central universities, including Delhi University, have supported this idea. It will be an entrance exam along with weightage to the school examination boards, because we don't want the school examination boards their value to be reduced. So it will be a mix of the scoring in the common entrance test and also the scores that students obtain in the respective school examination board. So this will also be, for central universities, they will all join, but if any deemed university or a state private university or a state university, any other institution, if they wish to use the score, they will be welcome. So all these changes you will see in the next academic year.
Right, sir. That makes it about 7. You said there are about 10.
Yes, there are smaller things also, particularly the credit bank will also have the different credit courses. So these new courses that UGC is bringing out, what will be the new modular courses? Because if it is multiple entry and exit,
right,
the courses will have to be redesigned. They will have to be modular. It is not that anybody who leaves after first year, if she or he have the modular course, then the year will be wasted. So it will be modular courses. It is not similarly for the 4-year degree program. It is not adding 1 year to the existing 3, but it will have to have a new type of a course altogether. That is also being worked out by UGC. the encouragement to distance education, that at least one university in every state should be in a position to offer distance education.
Right.
It could be a conventional university. Many of these states don't have open universities. So the conventional universities, if they wish to offer this type of, online courses or a course in a distance mode, they will also be allowed. The institution of excellence, right now we have identified 20 of them, 10 in private, 10 in the government sector. And there is a possibility, we are requesting the government to increase their number to 50, that is 25 on the public side, 25 on the private side, 25 on both sides, 25 each on both sides. So IOEs will be allowed to have their own courses. The multidisciplinarity that we have talked about, that will be started from the IOEs. So IOEs will be offering courses which will have a variety of choices instead of having just science, humanities, commerce. I mean, the traditional distinction that we make, professional, science, arts, commerce, and technical courses. Instead of that, they will have multidisciplinary courses. But again, this will start with the IOEs.
It's all really exciting, and some of it is truly radical, especially the common entrance exam. I'm heartened to note that Delhi University has agreed to be part of it, because the kind of percentage cutoffs we see are almost unrealistic, although they are achieved by students. It is quite remarkable. Do you see a radical change happening, in Delhi University, for instance? Let's talk about Delhi University itself. You see a radical change happening then?
It will be a change, I mean, radical or otherwise, we will see how things develop. But that change is required.
Yeah.
There is a need to have a change. And what we really need to do, and that is why we are taking a little more time, is to have this transition in a smooth manner.
Right.
In a planned manner. So whether it is a 4-year course or whether it is the common entrance exam, the idea is to build consensus. Some of the things have already occurred. What is there in the policy? You may have read that joint entrance exams results, IIT, JEE results were announced yesterday about the March exam.
Right.
So now that exam, the one-time exam, which became twice a year, is now 4 times a year. The entrance exams are also, the number of attempts that one can take is more. I mean, let the student have a choice in case they have any difficulty for whatever reason, personal reason or family reason. If they are not able to appear in one exam, they are not able to take a test, say in March, they can take it some other time. These type of, actions which really help the students, that will be there. The Higher Education Commission will take time because a great deal of consultation will be required with the states, with the private universities, with the state universities, because that commission is not only for the central institutions, it is for all the institutions of the entire country. So that we will come later after due consultation with the stakeholders.
You said less pressure on students, less pressure on parents as well, less chance of nervous breakdowns happening in families, I think.
Yes, pressure on the parents is also there. And more than the pressure on the parents and the students, there is also a question of the logistics.
Yeah.
Thousands of students moving from one place to another just to appear in a particular exam. Now, with the help of technology, online exams are possible.
Right.
So IIT, in fact, the JEE is totally online. NEET, of course, has not become online, but that we will have consultations this year with all the states. Some of the states are in favor of online, some are not in favor. So we'll try to build a consensus before we move to any new system for NEET.
Right. Wonderful. Professor Vedya, may I request you now to, ask Mr. Khare some of the questions that are top of your mind?
Yeah, so it was actually a perfect opening to hear about a series of progressive reforms that's going to start in the immediate academic session that we are going to see now. And as the secretary rightly pointed out, sir, you had said that the HECI will take time because it is very comprehensive considering the type of education institutions that we are handling. What strikes me is the last point that you mentioned on the institutions of eminence. We are extremely happy to hear that the list might get expanded from 20 to 50, 25 of them private and 25 of them public. One question that I have in my mind, in fact, I wrote a long article on this when the first round was happening. You know, in the private eligibility criteria, the need for 3,000 crores net worth of promoters was one eligibility criteria. Now, the new education policy seems to be having broad contours on performance and progress. Will the eligibility criteria also be based on performance
Yes.
of institutions and not net worth of promoters? That way, you know, there are institutions who are good performers, but net worth of promoters is not 3,000 crores, but we can see them perform. So can we expect a change in the eligibility criteria also?
There is some change. Some change is being considered for the eligibility criteria also, because under the existing criteria, not many institutions would qualify. And as you rightly mentioned, the policy is outcome based and not input based.
Yeah.
So the earlier criteria of net worth, buildings, etc., that they are all input based. The output based will be what is their accreditation, what is their ranking, because ultimately the excellence is measured in terms of the rankings or in terms of the accreditation, not in terms of the type of buildings or the infrastructure. I mean, that is required, it is a prerequisite, but that does not make it a good university, I mean, having infrastructure.
Yeah. So the other thing that I had in mind was on teacher education and vocational education. This, in my opinion, I feel the impact that it can create to a larger cross section of the society. Teacher education reach into schools and vocational education, considering the fact that we need a lot of skilled workforce. What is the thought process, the policy thought process in terms of the autonomy for universities to offer teacher education and vocational education without having to get approval from NCTE or AICT? Universities, they should be given autonomy to offer teacher education and vocational education to begin with. Is that something that's going to happen in the policy pipeline?
That is a part of the discussion of the Higher Education Commission. In fact, the important change which will be there in the Higher Education Commission, apart from the AICT and UGC coming together, will be the teacher education, which is part of the school education. It is considered to be part of the school education as of now, whereas they are all colleges which are higher educational institutions. So they will be brought under the Higher Education Commission. So whether it is technical education or teachers education, professional education, they will all be under the HECI. That is the proposal.
Yes, sir. And one thing that is actually very progressive is the type of universities that are going to exist as we move forward. Research universities, teaching universities with the potential for research, and then degree granting institutions. See, many of those who have been closely observing the new education policy, especially 1968, 1986, followed by 1992 program of action, and now the 2020 policy. The shelf life of these policies are actually 2 decades or 3 decades, but everybody wants things to happen overnight. But there are certain reform process that has to be done in a phased manner. Now, the type of universities, it's not an easy task to convert institutions to universities overnight. Now, what again do you think is the time frame that is required to convert the entire higher education ecosystem into these 3 types of broad categories? And do you think that it's realistic considering the total number of institutions that we have? Is it a challenge or do you think it's easily achievable over a period of time?
See, the policy itself provides for a 15-year window for these autonomous colleges to be upgraded. And under the Rashtriya Uchtar Shiksha Abhiyan, in fact, the funding is also being increased from this year to incentivize the state governments to convert some of these institutions into universities or in a cluster university, that 4 or 5 colleges can come together and form a cluster university. So that is the move in a direction to have more autonomy of the institutions. So that is that process will be long. What we are, as I said in the beginning, that those items which affect the students directly, that we are taking up first. And there are certain reforms which are essential to the system. But say the formation of the Higher Education Commission is a very necessary reform. But it does not directly have any bearing on the students. So the student-centric reforms are the ones which are being taken up immediately. That is, before the start of the next academic session, we would like the students to know what is there in store for them. And the other reforms that can come gradually over a period.
Yeah. Since you said student-centric, the definition of who the student itself is getting changing over a period of time, considering that, online education is going to occupy a significant space. Now, people who are even 40, 50, 60 see it as an opportunity to engage with the continuous learning process. And the new regulations for online and distance education has definitely encouraged a lot of universities. But is it enough adequate to convert India into an exporter of education? Because we see online education as a significant policy instrument that can convert India to an exporter of educational services than an importer, as we are seeing today. To that extent, do you think online education still needs more autonomy and freedom to convert this import to export?
See, online education is more required to address the domestic students, whatever be their age. Because if the numbers, the GER is to increase from, say, the present 27.4% to 50%,
Right.
what it translates is an additional enrollment of something like 4 crores, because the youth population is also increasing.
Yeah.
Therefore, online education will be more addressing more of the domestic students.
Yeah.
But last week we had a meeting with the private providers. In fact, the focus of Study India program, that export of education, the focus of Study India program was more on the central government institutions. But this time we have decided that private institutions having good facilities, what happens many a times that while the educational standards may be high in some of our institutions, those students who are coming from abroad, the international students, they expect a certain lifestyle or certain living standards which are not available in many of our institutions which have high-class academic standards, but perhaps their infrastructure for international students is lacking. Therefore, why not open the sector? And secondly, all international students, they have different backgrounds and all of them may not like to be in IIT or institutions of that type. Therefore, why not open the sector, whether it is private? In fact, what we have decided is that we will not have any distinction between private and public institutions as far as internationalization is concerned. Because what is required is that an international student should have a good experience of studying in India.
Yeah.
And India means everybody. The private Indian institutions, the state institutions, the central government institutions, but they are visitors, they are international students. Let us give them a good experience.
So to create that international ecosystem, the infrastructure ecosystem, the access to finance is very critical. Now, my question is on that because educational loans to students are categorized as priority sector lending, but access to debt to create that infrastructure is not under priority sector, but that's the finance ministry's decision. But is it possible that select institutions, public and private, considering that you are not going to differentiate between them, let's say select top 100 institutions, and we can access, foreign dollar denominated loans which are available at cheaper rates, and the government can give a sovereign guarantee, and based on the performance of the institutions, if we can have access to such funds, we will not accelerate the process of infrastructure creation, which otherwise is limited because of very limited access to capital in the Indian markets.
In fact, the reorganization of Higher Education Funding Agency and external commercial borrowing both have been indicated in this year's budget speech of the Honorable Finance Minister. And we are in discussion with the Finance Ministry once, because now the budget discussions are over. So they would be having some time now. In April, we are having discussion with them, because the financing of this sector cannot depend solely on the governments, that is central government or the state government, because they also have their own resource constraints. We have to raise funds from the market. In fact, the entire idea behind the Higher Education Funding Agency was to raise funds from the market and not circulate only the equity which the central government has given to the funding agency. So this is something which requires restructuring of the Higher Education Funding Agency. Some of the issues which are still not sorted out is about the sovereign guarantee. Because normally for such agencies, sovereign guarantees are not provided. So these are the issues which are under discussion with the Finance Ministry. But restructuring of HIFA and external commercial borrowing both are on the agenda.
But will that also include private institutions getting access to this? Because now it is limited to public institutions.
The restructuring will also mean whether we can include some of these private universities or the state universities with a state guarantee, because after all, the state governments also borrow from the Reserve Bank. So they can provide a guarantee, and if there is a default, it can be taken care through the Reserve Bank. So these are the items which are being discussed. But the funding agency, HIFA, will become more prominent as a funding agency and not the present system where they are just routing the central government funds to the central government institution. That is what is happening as of now.
Okay.
Mr. Chawla, any questions to the secretary?
No, I'm asking personal view. What does he think? Because people in North India don't speak many of the South Indian languages. Whether how to connect the people. Mr. Khare, you have some point of view on this?
As I mentioned to Madam Kaveri Bamzai in the beginning, it is not one nation, one language, but it is one nation, multiple languages. But why not use our languages? Now, one item which has been started this year, and it is a part of the education policy, it is mentioned there, to have Ek Bharat, Shresh Bharat. In fact, the program name, very few program names are mentioned in the policy. This is one of them. The policy itself gives the name Ek Bharat, Shresh Bharat. That why not people from North learn languages of, say, South India, or East India learning about West India? So it is not only Hindi, English, or say some language of Eastern India or Western India. Multilingualism in its widest form. And the second is the mother tongue teaching. So learning in the mother tongue or in the regional language. And second is the Ek Bharat Shresh Bharat program. Now what the Ek Bharat Shresh Bharat program has done, which was not possible a few years ago, what it has done is that 100 sentences in each of the 22 scheduled languages are available for the reader. And now with the help of technology, one can listen to these languages, to these sentences in whichever language one wants. Read it on the computer, also listen to the audio. So even the pronunciation can be corrected because one is listening through the audio. What we are trying is to develop a test where the computer audio will have a self quiz and one can even check whether what they have learnt is correct or not. So the Ek Bharat Shesh Bharat program, and it is not only limited to languages, even learning each other's culture, learning about the literature which is available in different languages, learning about for example, in this 75th year of India's independence, Azadi Ka Amrut Mahotsav, which is being celebrated, why not know about the historical places and the freedom fighters of who may be in the tribal areas of Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh or who may be in Manipur. The knowledge and the depth of the culture in every state is very high. And there is a need to understand all this. Unfortunately, I mean, what Mr. Chawla said, many a times we take more pride in learning, say, foreign language rather than learning an additional Indian language. The policy is saying, the policy has clearly emphasized, and it is one of the part of the policy to have programs like Ek Bharat Shesh Bharat. One is to have initial teaching in the mother tongue or in the regional language. And secondly, to learn each other's language so that we understand, people of the country understand each other much better.
Mr. Khare, one question I was trying to raise, because it is not a question, that you go to South India, you find many, many more South Indians speaking North Indian languages.
That is one view. But what is really what the policy has mentioned and what we are emphasizing is that let us try to learn more languages, more Indian languages, and to help them and to learn more languages. I mean, just saying that you learn a language is not enough.
Right.
They have to be assisted. And now with the help of technology, this assistance is possible.
Why can't they make it compulsory for people from North India to be in the primary education have one of the South Indian languages as a compulsory language?
No, the primary school teaching, what we have emphasized is on the mother tongue. So it is not a question of why, because mother tongue, the learning is more in the mother tongue at the early stages. So to have conceptual clarity, for example, a student in a tribal area, they have to first understand even Hindi and then try to understand what is being taught in the class. So if the teaching is in the same language, that is what is spoken at their home, they will be able to understand the concepts much better, and the learning levels, which are not very high. In fact, the various survey reports, including the survey reports within India, they have been indicating that class 5 and class 3 students in India, their learning levels are low. So that competence building can start easily by teaching in the mother tongue. The additional language that can come through the Ek Bharat Shesh Bharat, that is more of a voluntary program which will help in knowing a little bit of each other's language rather than introducing it as a medium of instruction at the primary level.
I think optional language should be there. The question is, why can't they hear one of the South Indian languages? And there should be provision for them or for the funding agency to provide for extra funding for learning additional Indian language, as you rightly pointed out.
No, additional Indian language is a different thing. The mother tongue teaching, that is at the early stages, say in the schools, teaching in mother tongue, that is to bring more conceptual clarity. It is to improve the competence levels. It is not so much to related to the language policy, but more related to the development of the student themselves, whether they can understand more in their own language.
Khare, I'm just giving, it's not a parallel example, correct example, but I'm giving example. Like, for example, you go to Europe, where you find that every European country citizen knows one language of another country, neighbor country, or somebody. French knows Italian, Italian knows French, French knows somebody, German. This is countries like ours should also know. Hindi speaking person should know Tamil, Tamil person should know Hindi or but the other language. Why can't develop that culture and encourage it right from the beginning?
No, you are absolutely correct. But that culture will come through the Ek Bharat, Shresh Bharat that we have mentioned in the policy. It will not come by making it mandatory at the school level that you try to learn another language. It has more to do with the exchanges that will be built. And language is one of the items of that, let us say, the Ek Bharat, Shresh Bharat program. Other being the culture, their diversity, their history, all that is required. But making it mandatory at the primary level, I think what is more important is that they learn how to learn, and that is possible in their own mother tongue or the regional language.
Just one thing, the last question, Coursera, they had a very successful IPO 2 weeks back. And one of the prime movers of the IPO was a huge market for online education in India. And you had rightly pointed out that our efforts is also to first leverage the domestic demand. Now, considering that, the COVIDian opportunity that has thrown up to the world of online education, how much do you think our higher education ecosystem has prepared itself in the last 1 year? And what do you think we need to do further? And what is going to be the ministry's helping hand or advisory support to encash on this growing demand for online education so that Indian higher education institutions don't miss the bus?
You see, as far as content is concerned, the Indian higher education system and the institutions have done very well. In fact, the content which is there in English as also in many of the Indian languages, that compares with the best in the world. And that content has been used last year. In fact, all the IITs and other technical institutions, even though physically they are closed, but they had their first and the second semester on the online mode. So running an entire course of, let us say, highly technical institution like IITs in an online mode has been possible. Now, what is required on the other side is the devices. You see, the access to these content, that is the limitation. And right now, because we are talking of IITs, the problem is limited. But once we reach out to, say, 3.8 crore college students, then this problem will become a challenge. That until unless devices and the connectivity is there, the best content will also find, even with best content, we'll not be able to reach out. In the pandemic, what we tried out was to have a mix of the digital with the television. That is, the same courses which are there on digital, they were also broadcast through the educational channel. But slowly we'll have to ensure that individual students have their own devices. Some of the states have gone ahead. The Finance Commission, headed by Mr. N.K. Singh, who submitted the report, they have made a strong recommendation for incentivizing the state governments to provide devices to the students. Because ultimately, pandemic or no pandemic, the online education is here to stay.
I'll ask the last question here because suddenly it occurred to me this online education and technology is going to increase the gap between have-nots and haves. The question is, even now during the pandemic, most of the people who did not have any connection at home, they were not able to attend classes. And in the villages where there is no power, how you will provide devices to them because they don't have the money to buy any smartphone or any other device which they can use sitting at home. How you sort that problem?
See, as I said, that 15th Finance Commission has made this recommendation. pandemic situation, what we had done, I have already mentioned that you have alternate courses through the medium of television, through the educational channels. But providing devices is not very difficult because we can have many of the state governments have already gone ahead and provided devices to the students. The electricity position is far better and connectivity through BharatNet is also there. So it will not be very difficult to reach out to every student. What is really required is that the content and the context, that is the devices, they should go together. And if they go together, the divide, in fact, which exists today, I mean, let me tell you the positive side of the online education. The divide which is there between, say, Delhi University, JNU, and the top IITs versus the regional engineering colleges or the state universities, that can be bridged by having the best lectures of these prestigious universities directly webcast to the remotest area of the country. So there is a positive side that now the best content is available to the remotest area. We cannot request a professor to travel all the way 2,000 kilometers, but the same lecture which he is delivering in Delhi or in Mumbai, that is webcast all the way to the remote places. And the systems which have now come on the online, that it is like a virtual classroom where people can ask questions, where they can interact directly with the faculty. So if you take the quality of education, I think online education is a great leveler. That whether I study in St. Stephen's at Delhi or I study in the Rajkiya Mahavidyalaya at some remote location, I can have access to the same lecture which is being provided, and I can also ask questions to the faculty. I can also interact with other students. So it is a great leveler in that way.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Khare, may I just quickly ask a last question? You know, this year has been quite terrible, especially for primary school students in, remote parts of India. They've lost an entire year. A lot of them have, in fact, especially younger students, have gone back to families. They've been employed as, they're working at home or they've been employed as laborers. What kind of efforts will the government do to sort of reclaim this lost year for these students, hoping that we are going to get back to physical education soon?
I mean, I don't deal with the primary education directly.
Right.
But let me assure you that the bridge course concept, which has been there in the primary education,
right,
that students who drop out,
yeah,
with the help of the local civil society, they are brought back to the system and offered a bridge course. Because supposing there is a 10-year-old,
yeah,
now she or he cannot be asked to sit with the class grade 1 students because there will be age difference.
Yeah.
But they can be offered a bridge course and then assimilated in the mainstream. So this has been the practice in the past and it has worked well.
So when can we expect schools and colleges to reopen? I think that is the biggest question.
Many of them had opened. Many of them had opened, but because of this spurt in COVID cases, unfortunately, some of the states have again issued orders for closure of the schools.
Right.
Otherwise, they had started opening.
Right. But do we expect the next academic year to be physical or still it'll be a hybrid form?
Digital.
Hybrid form is here to stay.
Yeah.
Pandemic or no pandemic, hybrid form is here to stay.
Right.
I call it digital.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Khare, for being in charge of our, education destiny. I hope in 15 years from now, we see a new kind of young Indian emerging who is more capable of taking on the new challenges of the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have an engagement at 5, so I must leave.
Yeah. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed that session. If you want to catch the other sessions of the ThinkEdu Conclave 2021, you can log on to eventexpress.com, newindianexpress.com, or even edxlive.com. If you are more of a social media person, you can also join us on our Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube handle. Thank you for watching. Added to the fear of contracting the virus in a pandemic are the significant changes to our daily lives as our movements are restricted in support of efforts to contain and slow down the spread of the coronavirus. Faced with new realities of working from home, homeschooling our children, and lack of physical contact with other family members, friends, and colleagues, it is important that we take good care of our mental health. To speak about just that, we have with us Vikram Patel, the Pershing Square Professor of Global Health in the Blavatnik Institute's Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School. He is also an adjunct professor and joint director at the Center for Chronic Conditions and Injuries at the Public Health Foundation of India. He will be in conversation with senior journalist and author Kaveri Bamzai.
You know, one of the things I heard you talking about recently was this idea of the unconditional income support to prevent stress and mental health illness. That's a fantastic idea. Would you like to discuss it a little more?
Absolutely. Actually, I've had the privilege of mentoring a very bright young Brazilian postdoctoral fellow who works with me in my lab in Harvard. And she has been analyzing the impact of Brazil's conditional cash transfer program, which is probably the largest direct to beneficiary cash transfer program that was launched by the government of Lula about 20 years ago. And it was really an effort to raise the income levels of the poor in Brazil and reduce disparities. It is astonishing, Kaveri. Her data shows, and this is more than 100 million people, so it's the largest, almost a countrywide program. Her data shows convincingly that when people receive conditional cash transfers, not only is their economic status improved, but suicide mortality has dropped by 50%, as much as 50% during the decade following receipt of the conditional cash transfer, and in particular amongst young people. And the disparities between the Black Brazilians, which is historically one of the more disadvantaged communities in Brazil, and white Brazilians has narrowed. To me, this is the largest compelling demonstration about the value of conditional cash transfers or even unconditional cash transfers like universal basic income interventions on promoting the mental health of populations, particularly those who are economically in the weaker segments of society.
Would a Manrega not qualify as a cash transfer? Would it has there been any study that looks at this?
Well, MNREGA is a cash transfer
Yeah.
program. It's obviously, though, it is linked to actually having rural employment. And if obviously, if there is no jobs in the rural areas, then you're not going to get rural employment. So in that sense, it is a cash transfer program with lots of restrictions and limitations. The Brazilian program is direct to the beneficiary. You don't actually have to be working at all. So I think there are differences, but fundamentally, there is a commonality in that the state is directly transferring money to people who are relatively poor and therefore have no other source of income. Now, that said, a bigger question is, have we evaluated the impact of MNREGA on people's health and well-being, particularly their mental health? Not that I know of, but I will say something very curious about our cash transfer programs, which is the opposite of giving a cash to help people promote their mental health. And that is, of course, the compensation we give families of farmers who've committed suicide. And I remember very vividly, I used to work a lot in the Vidarbha area for many years. And I remember very vividly being in one of the villages where there had been a number of farmer suicides. And I remember this woman whose husband had died coming to me in tears. And she said, we got this compensation after my husband killed himself. I do not understand why the government didn't give him the money in the form of debt relief. It was, and I stood there, And I had no answer. And I said, so we have effectively incentivized suicide. It's such a bizarre policy dynamic that instead of saying, let us give money to those who need it so
Right.
that they can actually get on with their lives and rebuild their lives. Instead, we say, no, after you kill yourself, we'll then give the money to your surviving family. I don't know. This is a kind of perverse system that defies any logic here. But anyway, that's a contrast to a lot of our cash transfer programs in India. We give it at the wrong time rather than it's not a preemptive cash transfer. It's actually a reactive cash transfer, which I think is a wasted opportunity and a wasted life.
That's People Live all over again. The movie was all about this.
Yeah, exactly.
You
Actually,
remember?
of course,
Yeah.
I remember the movie.
Yeah,
Terrific film.
yeah. You know, the other thing that has struck me over this period that we've been through is the family dynamic. There's been a lot of talk about domestic violence, about physical and psychological abuse within the family increasing. Again, I've not read any data as such, but there's been a lot of conversation around that. Have you looked at that, especially in India? We've heard a lot of cases of substance abuse as well going up, especially alcohol. Have you seen that? Have you studied that?
I'll tell you, Kaveri, one of the real problems right now with the pandemic is how little reliable data there is
Right.
on all of these consequences of the pandemic, and particularly the consequences of the lockdown and the containment policy. So what we rely on isn't really the kind of data that I would say can easily generalize to the whole country. The qualitative studies, very focused deep dives, individual narratives of their experiences, etc. The extent to which we can generalize this, I don't know, but those stories certainly speak to what you just described, that the vulnerabilities of women who already were vulnerable because they lived, for example, in relationships where there was spousal violence has increased dramatically. The vulnerabilities of children living in those families to be exposed to violence has increased. And of course, now children are trapped at home,
Exactly.
oftentimes with nowhere else to go. And school is often an escape. It's not just a
Yeah.
place, where kids went to learn geography and history. It's a place where kids went often to get away from very
Yeah.
difficult home environments, to get food, to be able to play, to be able to interact with one's peers. But so all of these, there's a lot of qualitative data that I think speaks to this. But if I had to look at quantitative data, we already have very good quantitative data from other countries.
Right.
And there is no reason for me to believe that India is going to somehow necessarily be totally different.
Right.
And the one country, as you know, I live between India and the US. In the US, we now have robust quantitative data that is showing without any doubt that mortality, which is the hard outcome of that we're all concerned with, has risen in the last year due to suicide and substance use. This is a very dangerous trend in the US, and it is being attributed. Obviously, these are early data. In fact, this is actually a report that is still confidential, but will be published in the very near future. But what it's clearly indicating is that there is a crisis of mental health in the US that is playing itself out, not just in terms of people reporting poor mental health symptoms, but actually people taking actions that can ultimately lead to the loss of their own lives. For example, through heavy drinking, the use of more dangerous substances like opioids, as well as, of course, suicide. Unfortunately, our data systems in India are nowhere near as real time as the one in the US. So we'll probably only know what the impact has been in the last year and perhaps in a year from now, which is unfortunate.
Do you feel that the family has changed fundamentally during this period? And is that change irreversible? Or can we make interventions to actually prevent a lot of the psychological abuse that has happened?
Kaveri, I won't be able to comment specifically on the change in the family during the last year. I don't have that kind of information to comment on it. But I will say one thing is that actually working with families, in my mind, is the most important way to
Yeah.
prevent gender-based violence. Right now, our state policy is very reactive.
Yeah.
We wait for the violence to occur,
Yeah.
and then we try to help the woman who is affected to find a way around that. And in a patriarchal society like ours, we know that actually the vast majority of women neither seek that kind of help because they're, in a sense, entrapped really in this kind of society that they are living in, but also that the solutions we're offering them, that is to criminalize their male partner or to get them to leave homes, are really acceptable to a very small fraction of women in our country. So I strongly believe that we do need to look at prevention, primary prevention, which is to say to prevent the violence from occurring in the very first place. And while we have good legislative instruments for that, I fear those legislative instruments are still too reactive. They're very punitive. They're very much around the idea of criminalizing the male perpetrator. I believe that really exciting kind of evidence that that people are generating in India. There's a team, for example, that is working from Nari in Pune, which is looking at interventions that can work on spousal relationships, couple dynamics. And I've always wondered, why do we not use the opportunity when couples register to get married to actually require them to actually have a month or intense deep dive of understanding how to live with someone else. Because let's not forget that for a significant majority of young people who are going to get married in India, their first sexual encounter, their first encounter of living with someone in a romantic relationship, their first encounter of being able to create a new family for themselves will happen on the night of their marriage. And it is like, there's no preparation. Their own parents have not prepared them. School education, the sex education, the life skills you get there is pretty, in most cases, it's very poorly delivered and it's pretty primitive. They have no knowledge. And I think this could be such an exciting and preventative intervention, not only to prevent domestic violence, but actually to promote mental health and well-being for both young men and young women who are about to get married.
I think that's fascinating. But, Dr. Patel, you've also talked about this whole idea how, because of the criminalizing of a lot of love as well, especially if it's interfaith, even that escape, even that freedom, once it gets criminalized, I mean, where does it leave young people? It leaves them very dejected, doesn't it?
Well, Kaveri, I think you're referring to my recent writings here. Let me tell you first of all, India has a crisis of young people's mental health. Every metric, whether by crisis I don't mean just young people are angry or young people are sad. No, young people are killing themselves. In epic numbers. India's youth suicide rate is one of the highest on the planet, and it has been steadily going up over the last decade. We've known about this, and by the way, these are not my data; these are the government's own data. So there's no secret about correct the NCRB data and the RGI data, the Million Death Study that the Registrar General of India conducts, which I think is far more reliable, because it's not based on police records, but actually or cause of death assessments in a representative sample of 1 million households in the country. So the fact is that there is a crisis of young people's mental health. The fact is we have no policy response to it. We have a national mental health policy, which is a policy, but actually there is very little recognition of the differing needs of young people and the rest of the population, and also the fact that most young people's mental health problems are not just linked to some kind of biological medical condition or a psychiatric disorder. It's got to do with the social environments that young people are finding themselves in. And one of those very important social drivers of young people's suicide and poor mental health is the denial of opportunities that fit the aspirations of India's millennials. And those aspirations are totally different from those of their parents. They are shaped by India's economic development story, they're shaped by globalization, and of course, they're shaped by social media. And so we have this generation of India's youth who have different aspirations from that of their parents and grandparents. And there is literally a real battle about whose aspirations are going to prevail. And in that battle right now, the emergence of very conservative, orthodox attitudes about young people's sexuality and their right to choose who they love, who they live with, is, I think, at the forefront of what is driving many young people to become depressed and ultimately to kill themselves.
Right. Dr. Patel, you've also argued for the decriminalizing of marijuana, which again is a very contentious topic in India. But I mean, it stands to reason, doesn't it? Of course, a lot of people feel that it's the gateway to harder drugs. But what do you think? I mean, what do you think should happen in India? We don't have an obvious opioid crisis, but I think we do have a rising drug issue in India.
Yeah, we definitely, it's not a clear cut case. It depends very much on you know, assessing the relative costs and benefits of a total prohibitionary policy on
Yeah,
any substance has to be then balanced against a similar cost benefit analysis of a more liberal, decriminalized, or even a legalized policy. And one has to really judge this in a very empirical way. One can't be guided only by one's ideology. And this is my understanding of the situation, that by criminalizing about what could be potentially 10% of India's population, you are not going to achieve any kind of development goal, especially when 99% of those 10% will never graduate to more serious substances. That's the first thing to bear in mind. So, in order to control the gateway to harder drugs by slamming a criminal charge on the overwhelming majority of users of cannabis who will never get into more serious drug use seems to me to be completely counterintuitive. Instead, there are many other ways that I know work in the public health context that can help minimize the graduation into more serious drugs. So that's the first thing to say. The second, the opioid crisis in the US, which is where the country, the country that's been worst affected, is not just simply about the availability of drugs. It's about the medical industrial complex. There is a rich history about this. It is about pharmaceutical companies that were heavily lobbying the US government to make pain relief one of the 5 cardinal signs of patient care. The US Congress actually passed a law requiring doctors to actually prescribe medications that their pharmaceutical donors and sponsors were saying they should prescribe.
right.
It is a systematic collusion between doctors, pharmacists, the pharmaceutical industry, and elected officials. And I think we should not think the opioid is the problem here. The problem is the commercialization and the deep, deep state, the dark state that exists between the pharmaceutical lobby and politicians. We need to protect India from that.
Right.
If there is one lesson, what is far more dangerous than the drug itself is the collusion of private sector commercial interests with the with legislation and our elected officials. As long as we continue to make sure that if we decriminalize drugs, but do it purely under a state-sponsored policy,
Right.
where the sale and distribution of drugs is entirely controlled by the state, is heavily regulated, is heavily taxed, under the same kinds of rules in many ways to what we do for tobacco. Actually, tobacco is commercialized, and you can see that. But if you remove the commercial interest, but everything else is similar to tobacco: taxation,
Right.
prohibition of young people's use, provision of counseling for those who want to stop, etc. I believe that is a safe and more balanced policy towards cannabis in our country.
Right. Let's go back a little to the mental health issue, the pandemic. How did you see India reacting? I'm especially concerned about the middle class because they've often been the intellectual and emotional leaders of the country. I had the sense that when we saw the kind of migration happening, people just being abandoned, I had the sense that we displayed an utter lack of empathy and sensitivity. Do you feel that somewhere the middle class has lost that leadership of the country in a way?
Yeah, well, Kaveri, this is such a troubling question, because obviously you and me belong to that same
Yes,
class. And so we're talking about our own class here,
ourselves.
ourselves and our class, our families, our social networks, people we dine with, we
Yeah.
live with. I'll be honest with you, I was devastated by how my class, our class, has responded, but not surprised.
Hmm.
I think what the pandemic has done is expose the deep class divisions that have existed in this country for decades. But I have to say the degree of callousness that was displayed by the upper and middle classes, a small cabal of those classes, the legislators of our country, the wealthy more generally, to the plight of the vast majority of our country who found themselves dispossessed on the streets, hungry, trudging home under the most appalling conditions and facing police violence as they did that, left me completely stunned. And I'm sure you must know of the book by Harsh Mandar,
Yeah.
Locking Down the Poor.
Oh my God,
I
that is
do.
such
It
an
is.
indictment of us.
Yeah, it is a heartrending and brutal, but absolutely on the mark account of how India's upper classes looked away when the majority of our people needed us the most.
Right.
And I believe this division has also woken up the rest of our country to realizing how callous, selfish, and uncaring upper classes are,
Yeah.
and that when it comes to the crunch, India's poor and marginalized are on their own.
Absolutely.
We're not going to be standing out for them.
Right. And I think that's a terribly harsh lesson, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it is a harsh lesson, and it tells you how long a distance we have to go as a society to build a civil society that is
Right.
truly integrated. We talk of national identity. To me, actually, I don't think we have one. If there was ever a proof that we don't stand together as a nation, what happened during and after the lockdown is vivid proof that we only stood for ourselves and our particular class. That is what mattered. You know, I remember the Resident Welfare Association colonies of Delhi, where the only concern of the colonies was not to let my servants go out of the house because they will bring the virus back and infect me. As opposed to thinking, what are my servants' families doing as they are locked into my house and they are locked out of the colony?
Right.
It staggered the imagination that all that we could think about was our own safety and our own needs. And that it almost became, at times, conversations I would have with people in those colonies. It almost sounded like you're talking about slaves. You're talking indentured laborers. It was shocking, beyond belief shocking. But I think the good thing I'll tell you in this is that the vast majority of India's people now realize that we are not going to be around for them, and that they're going to have to make the right decisions in terms of their livelihoods, the political choices they make, that is going to actually stand for their interests.
Yeah, and I hope they make the right choices. The other thing I think that we've not talked about enough as a society is the impact on young children who've actually lost a year of socializing, of playing with their peers, of studying in classrooms, especially early age. I wonder what kind of impact it must have had on their psychology.
Yeah, I have been very worried about this, Kaveri. The first thing to say is that that's another great example of how those who have no voice have had no place at the table when decisions were made.
Right.
We've just talked about the migrant workers and more generally India's, daily wage workers, not just migrant workers. Let's be honest, the people who are most affected by the lockdown are those who earn every day.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't earn every day. It affected me not at all. But if I was earning every day, what I ate tomorrow was based on what I earned today.
Right.
Then obviously a strategy like a lockdown basically means I'll go hungry tomorrow, and so will my wife or my husband and my kids. So in the same way, I would argue children's voices have also been completely blanked out.
Right.
Yet we have taken away from children the single most important sector for their development and their well-being, which is their schools. What have we done? We've essentially reduced schools to places of learning.
Yeah.
Firstly, which is of course a completely false and narrow narrative of what schools actually are for kids. But secondly, we've assumed that all of India's kids have access to remote learning opportunities.
Exactly.
I mean, I cannot even.
Boggles the mind.
It's mind-boggling, right? I mean, you're living in a country. You say, I mean, are you even aware of what India's children's experiences are to assume that teachers And institutions, particularly in the government sector, and the kids who go there will automatically pivot to remote learning. I mean, are you even living in a real India? Yeah, do you have connection with reality? And again, I have to say it's another great example of how we've totally thrown our children under the bus. In Goa, where I am right now, here's the incredible thing: casinos have already opened. Casinos opened 3 to 4 months ago.
But not
Schools are
schools.
still closed. Just think about that. Who have we prioritized? Gamblers to come to Goa to gamble on ships versus our own children to get into schools and start doing what schools, in experience
Yeah.
what schools actually offer children. What a bizarre set of policies. How we prioritize in this country sometimes leaves me completely baffled.
Absolutely. And I think you only have to be present at, when a midday meal is served to see the hunger, and it's so brutal, when you see children just lining up to eat, just that experience. Just take, I mean, forget about learning, forget about socializing. Some kids just come to eat, they don't get
Absolutely.
enough.
And by the way, Kaveri, that's not only true in India. This is also true in the U.S.
Right.
My own colleagues in Harvard, when the pandemic began, they were calling for school closures, and this was, obviously done to only control the pandemic. They hadn't thought about the impact that had on kids. Today, the very same colleagues say, well, actually, the policy should be this, and I'm actually gonna paraphrase what they said. Schools should be the last to close and
Right.
the first to open.
Yeah.
And I think that tells you why, what the central role of schools are for children's lives. The last to close in a situation. Obviously,
Right.
there will be situations where we have to close that, but they should be the last sector of society to close and the very first to open. Before planes start flying, before casinos start operating,
Yeah.
before holidays begin, start schools.
Right. Have we, in a sense, have we recovered from this pandemic? I know we're talking about the vaccine and how things will go back to what they were. Have we recovered psychologically? Have we recovered mentally, or have we regressed in many ways? You've seen two societies quite closely now over the last 9 months. What is has there been any fundamental change?
Because this is such a fast changing situation,
Yeah.
I can only speak for now. Maybe by tomorrow, the situation will change again. Some new variant will appear and etc. But from what we know right now, what we can see right now, I have to say I detect a real shift in mood. I find that people are a lot more optimistic. There is a sense that, okay, we've finally beaten this damn thing. And I have to say, there is a real growing confidence again in science, which I think is one of the positive things that come out of this whole pandemic. Because let's not minimize the miracle
Yeah.
that has happened in the last year. It's truly a miracle, Kaveri. The miracle that just over a year ago, a new unknown pathogen spread across the world, and in just about a year, we now have incredibly effective vaccines, many different ones as well. It is a true miracle of science. And I think if there's one positive, there are many things that should come out of the pandemic, of course, but amongst them, one that I think should really be very important is the value of science as a central component of a country's development policy. The other thing I will also add is the value of a strong public healthcare system, because where has the public healthcare system been until the vaccination campaign began? They are really the foundation. If today we're able to reach as many people as we have, it is thanks to our public healthcare system. And I think this is another, for the first time, people of our class are going to government hospitals to get a COVID vaccine because that's the only place you could go. And I think we're finally seeing that this is a sector that belongs to all of us.
All of us.
And it is something we should demand our government to strengthen and invest in.
When we start doing that to our government schools, that's when real change will happen as well. These two sectors, if the middle class starts taking it seriously, I think, there'll be a world of change. But, you talked about this confidence in science, but going forward, do you see it being part of policy in any way? Do you see, for instance, we've been working on the HIV vaccine for the longest time. Nothing came of it. Although a lot of those people were actually redeployed to, work on to research this vaccine. But given that this is supposed to occur or recur, do you think that value of science will remain?
Well, every virus is different.
Yeah,
The fact is, you're right about the HIV. HIV is not the only one. Malaria is another one.
malaria. Yeah,
So it's not as if the immune response and to every pathogen is the same.
yeah,
So I wouldn't say, oh, we succeeded in
yeah.
COVID, but we failed in HIV. I think there are very fundamental differences between these infections. What I will say is that in spite of our mixed history of success against infectious diseases, the last year therefore must be seen as even a super miracle
Right.
that an unknown pathogen a year ago has led to all these successful vaccines. If anything, I believe that this is a call to action, a call to arms. And by the way, I wouldn't only say this is a call to arms for our government, it also is for the private sector to invest in basic research and development, but also translational research, which is to say, a vaccine is only going to be used if you can prove that it works at the population level. So, what we really need is a kind of a pipeline
Right.
from the lab, from the bench, where vaccines are being engineered, to clinical science, where vaccines are being tested in controlled settings, ultimately to population science, where vaccines are being tested on scale. And we've seen this happen remarkably with the COVID vaccines, especially the homegrown one, Covaxin. They've really gone through every step,
Right.
and I think it's an exemplar of what India can achieve if they are provided, if people are provided with the right resources, both intellectual but also monetary.
I wanted to ask you about the deaths of despair, which you've been talking about for a while, the impact of the 2008 recession on mental health, and you divided it into the mood and anxiety conditions and substance abuse. Do you feel the recession sort of engendered by this pandemic will also have maybe a bigger kind of global despair? Will it remain?
So a couple of things, I think context is really important. Context is
Yeah.
terribly important for the pandemic. As we've
Yes.
seen right now, the countries with the least human resources for health and the least per capita spending on health have done the best.
Yes.
And
Which is so
it
fascinating.
is totally fascinating. And people say it's about India. No, it's not actually. India is actually a pretty high mortality rate compared to
Yeah.
Africa. So there's something else going on, and time will tell what it is. But I've always argued from the very beginning that context is important, and
Right.
a one size fits all has never been true of any epidemic. And it was absurd to me that right at the outset of this epidemic, we assumed that what happened in northern Italy, what happened in New York City, was immediately what was going to happen in Mumbai and Johannesburg. And I think it staggers the imagination that more than a century of knowledge about how important context is in the spread of the epidemic was thrown out, and we just assumed a one size fits all. Anyway, in the same note, you can apply the same to mental health. So, for example, the opioid crisis, as I mentioned earlier, in the US cannot be seen independently of the incredible medical industrial complex of the US.
Right. As you said.
And so that doesn't exist in India. For example, opioids are not manufactured in the kind of way they're in the US, etc. So I don't fear about opioids in India as I do in the US.
Right.
Similarly, when it comes to suicide, there is a very particular context in the US of suicide of particularly working class and especially white Americans. And a lot of that has to do also with white privilege and the loss of white privilege, particularly in rural
Right.
counties of the US. Again, that doesn't translate
Right.
to India in the same way. In India, what I would worry about is not so much the economic recession, because I believe that we will bounce back because, this is still a country with a huge internal market. I believe it's orthodoxy.
Right.
I believe it's polarization. I believe it's the rising oppression of young people to express who they are as individuals, whether it's their politics, whether it's social causes they champion, whether it's their romantic interests.
Hmm.
It is this which is the single biggest threat to young people's mental health. I also believe, to be honest, when it comes to farmers, that if policies don't take into account their own economic security, and there are many ways of doing that. I'm not an expert in that, and I'm not making a judgment for or against the farm laws either. I'm just simply saying that whatever policies are made, if we do not take into account the vulnerable smallholding farmer, we will get the same problem as we saw as the US has seen, which is dramatic increases in suicide and substance use in the most vulnerable farmers, and of course, therefore, a worsening of our suicide crisis.
Absolutely. Great. It's been great talking to you, Dr. Patel, as always. It's so illuminating, and you put everything into perspective and you give us context. And I wanted to recall Arundhati Roy's words in Harsh Pandhar's book, where she said the pandemic was not just a mirror but an X-ray. And I thought, wasn't that so perfect? It really was an X-ray of our society, of who we are.
Yeah, I think she uses the word the pandemic as a portal.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that's exactly the way I see it too. It has exposed historic divisions in our society. It
Right.
has exposed a number of fracture lines in our
Yeah.
country. They've always been around. The pandemic has not created them, but it certainly brought them into full relief.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Patel, for
Thank you,
talking.
Kaveri. Thank you so
Yes,
much for
pleasure.
interviewing me. Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed that session. If you want to catch the other sessions of the ThinkEdu Conclave 2021, you can log on to eventexpress.com, newindianexpress.com, or even edxlive.com. If you are more of a social media person, you can also join us on our Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube handle. Thank you for watching.